There's a quiet lie people tell themselves when life feels unbearable. They say, I hate my life. But look closer. If you truly hated life, you wouldn't still be searching for meaning. You wouldn't be watching this. What you hate is this version of life, the one shaped by choices you outgrew, fears you tolerated, and comfort that slowly turned into a cage. And that realization changes everything. Number one, misplaced hatred. When people say they hate life, what they're really doing is mislabeling their pain. Hatred feels easier than precision. It's a broad, blunt emotional weapon that doesn't require responsibility or clarity. Saying, I hate life, creates distance between you and the problem, as if existence itself turned against you personally. But life, in its raw form, is neutral. It unfolds without opinion. What hurts is not life itself, but the narrow structure you're forced to inhabit every day. The routines you repeat without meaning, the roles you play without belief, the choices you keep defending even though they quietly drain you. Hatred becomes a way to mask disappointment, because disappointment implies that something mattered to you and didn't turn out the way you hoped. Most people don't realize how carefully their resentment is targeted until they slow down enough to look at it. The anger shows up in the morning, heavy and uninvited. It shows up in conversations that feel hollow, in work that feels pointless, in relationships that feel more like obligations than connections. Over time, that irritation hardens into a story that life itself is the enemy. But what's really being rejected is a version of existence built on compromise. Small ones at first, then larger ones that reshape your entire identity. You didn't choose this life all at once. You chose it gradually, often under pressure, often out of fear, often because survival demanded it. And now the cumulative weight of those choices feels unbearable. Misplaced hatred is dangerous because it blinds you. If life is the problem, there's nothing you can do about it. You endure, distract yourself, or numb out. You wait for something external to change. Circumstances, people, luck, while quietly deteriorating inside. But when you recognize that your hatred is aimed at a specific configuration of your life, something shifts. The frustration becomes informative rather than destructive. It points directly to the areas where you're living out of alignment with what you value, where you're betraying yourself in ways that once felt necessary but no longer are. This hatred didn't come from nowhere. It formed as a signal, an internal alarm that you've stretched yourself too far in directions that no longer reflect who you are becoming. You outgrew certain compromises, but your life didn't evolve with you. So the mind labels the whole experience as unbearable, when in reality, it's the mismatch that's intolerable. You don't hate being alive. You hate waking up each day and performing a life that no longer belongs to you. Number two, awareness before change. Change doesn't begin with action, motivation, or confidence. It begins with awareness, and awareness is rarely gentle. It arrives as discomfort, as unease, as the quiet recognition that something you've been tolerating no longer feels sustainable. Most people try to skip this stage because it hurts. It forces you to confront the gap between the life you're living and the life you know, deep down, you're capable of living. Awareness strips away comforting narratives and excuses. It takes away the illusion that things are fine when they're merely familiar. And familiarity, when it no longer serves you, becomes a slow form of self-abandonment. The mind resists awareness because awareness demands honesty, and honesty threatens stability. It destabilizes routines, relationships, and identities you've carefully constructed to survive. Once you see clearly, you can't unsee. You begin to notice how often you say yes when you mean no, how often you choose comfort over truth, how frequently you silence your own instincts to avoid conflict or uncertainty. This isn't empowering at first. It feels like standing in the middle of your life, suddenly aware of all the ways it doesn't fit, without yet knowing how to change it. That liminal space is where many people turn back, convincing themselves that ignorance was better. But awareness is not cruelty. It's precision. It doesn't accuse you of failure. It reveals misalignment. You're not broken. You're living according to outdated rules. The version of you who made certain decisions needed safety, acceptance, or stability, and those needs shaped your life in ways that once made sense. Awareness doesn't erase that context. It deepens it. It allows you to see your past choices with compassion rather than shame, while still acknowledging that repeating them will continue to cost you. Without awareness, change becomes impulsive and chaotic. You burn bridges without understanding why, replace one coping mechanism with another, confuse movement with growth. Sitting with awareness requires discipline. It means resisting the urge to act immediately just to relieve the discomfort. Instead, you observe. You listen to where resentment concentrates, where energy drains, where your body tightens in response to certain environments or expectations. This kind of self-observation is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Once you recognize a pattern, you're responsible for it, not instantly, not perfectly, but consciously. Awareness asks you to admit that staying the same is a choice, even when change feels frightening. Real transformation is slow because awareness deepens before behavior shifts. You don't uproot a life overnight. You first learn to see it clearly, in all its compromises and contradictions, without flinching, without romanticizing the pain, without rushing to escape it. Number 3, identity versus circumstance. One of the most damaging confusions people live with is the belief that their circumstances define who they are. Over time, roles harden into identities. The job you took out of necessity becomes the proof of what you're worth. The relationship you stayed in too long becomes evidence of what you deserve. The habits you formed to cope with stress begin to feel like personality traits rather than survival strategies. Slowly, quietly, you stop distinguishing between who you are and what happened to you, and that collapse of meaning makes change feel impossible, because changing circumstances starts to feel like erasing yourself. Circumstance is external and temporary, even when it lasts for years. Identity is internal and evolving, even when it feels fixed. But when life applies enough pressure, financial strain, emotional instability, uncertainty, you fuse the two. You start introducing yourself through limitations. You say things like, "I'm just not that kind of person," or "this is how my life has always been," without realizing you're describing a context, not a core truth. These statements provide a strange comfort. If circumstances are identity, then there's no need to risk change. You can accept your situation as fate rather than confront the fear of becoming someone unfamiliar. The problem is that identity built on circumstance is brittle. It only holds as long as the conditions remain the same. When those conditions shift, or when the internal cost becomes too high, the identity begins to crack. That's when people experience confusion, anxiety, and resentment without a clear source. They feel lost, not because they've lost themselves, but because the version of themselves they were performing no longer aligns with their internal values. The pain comes from defending an identity that was never meant to be permanent. Separating identity from circumstance is unsettling because it removes the excuse of inevitability. If you are not your environment, not your past, not your coping mechanisms, then you're left with a deeper responsibility. Deciding who you are beneath adaptation. That question has weight. It demands introspection rather than reaction. It requires you to grieve the version of yourself that survived but didn't flourish. Yet within that grief is possibility, because identity grounded in values rather than conditions is flexible, resilient, and self-directed. When you begin to see circumstances as something you navigate rather than something you are, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop defending limitations and start examining them. You recognize that behaviors developed under pressure don't have to remain once the pressure shifts. This doesn't mean denying your past or minimizing hardship. It means refusing to let temporary structures dictate permanent self-definition. You carry the lessons forward without carrying the cage, understanding that who you were in a constrained life is not the final expression of who you are. Number 4, responsibility as liberation. Responsibility is often framed as a burden, something heavy placed on your shoulders once circumstances leave you no choice. People associate it with sacrifice, restriction, and obligation, as if taking responsibility means accepting blame for everything that went wrong. But responsibility, when understood correctly, is not about self-punishment. It's about reclaiming agency. The moment you accept responsibility for your life, you stop waiting to be rescued by events, people, or outcomes you can't control. You stop positioning yourself as a passive character in your own story, and that shift alone changes how life feels from the inside. Avoiding responsibility offers short-term relief, but it quietly reinforces powerlessness. If everything is someone else's fault, or the world's, or your past's, then there's nothing you can do except endure. That stance may protect you from guilt, but it also traps you in stagnation. Responsibility does the opposite. It narrows your focus to what is within your control, your choices, your patterns, your willingness to confront discomfort. This narrowing is not a limitation, it's a release. When you stop carrying the impossible task of controlling life and instead focus on governing yourself, your energy becomes more concentrated and effective. Taking responsibility also requires brutal honesty. It means acknowledging where you stayed silent to avoid conflict, where you chose comfort over growth, where you delayed change because the cost felt too high. This honesty is painful because it dismantles excuses that once kept you emotionally safe. But those same excuses were also keeping you stuck. Responsibility doesn't erase context or hardship. It doesn't deny that some circumstances were unfair or overwhelming. It simply recognizes that continuing to live as though you have no influence perpetuates the very suffering you're trying to escape. There is freedom in realizing that even small decisions matter. You may not be able to rewrite your past, but you can decide how much authority it holds over your present. You can decide what behaviors you will no longer justify, what standards you will stop negotiating away. Responsibility restores the link between effort and outcome, a link that often breaks when people feel chronically defeated. Reestablishing that connection is stabilizing. It gives your actions meaning again. What makes responsibility liberating rather than crushing is that it returns ownership of your life to you. No one else has to change first. No perfect moment has to arrive. You don't need permission to act differently. When responsibility becomes a choice rather than a sentence, it shifts from something you carry to something that carries you. It organizes your priorities, sharpens your decisions, and replaces resentment with direction, allowing you to move forward without waiting for circumstances to justify your growth. Number 5, sacrifice and reset. Real change is never additive. It's subtractive. People often imagine transformation as something they can layer on top of their existing lives. New habits, new goals, new motivation, while leaving everything else untouched. But the lives we outgrow are held together by patterns that quietly demand loyalty. Certain routines, identities, and relationships survive not because they're good, but because they're familiar. A reset isn't about starting over from nothing. It's about deciding what no longer deserves to come with you, and that decision costs something every time. Sacrifice is uncomfortable because it forces you to let go of parts of yourself that once served a purpose. You grieve old versions of competence, old roles that gave you structure, even old pain that felt predictable. There is a strange safety in suffering, you understand. Letting go of that suffering means stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. That's why people cling to lives that make them miserable. They know the rules there. Sacrifice removes the illusion of certainty, and in doing so, exposes you to risk. Not dramatic risk, but the quieter, more terrifying risk of change that unfolds slowly and demands consistency. A true reset often looks unimpressive from the outside. It's saying no where you used to say yes, even when it disappoints people. It's dismantling routines that numbed you but also kept you functional. It's accepting short-term instability for long-term alignment. This kind of sacrifice isn't heroic or visible. No one applauds restraint, discipline, or the decision to walk away from environments that drained you. And yet, without these losses, nothing genuinely new can emerge. People resist sacrifice because they misinterpret it as punishment. They think giving something up means admitting it was a mistake. In reality, sacrifice honors context. You acknowledge that what once helped you survive may now be preventing you from growing. Resetting your life doesn't mean erasing your past, it means updating your structure. Growth requires space, and space only appears when something else is removed. The reset phase feels disorienting because identity lags behind behavior. You let go of familiar anchors before new ones fully form. In that gap, doubt creeps in, tempting you to return to what's known. But that instability is not failure, it's transition. Sacrifice creates the conditions for clarity by stripping away excess noise. When you remove what no longer fits, you begin to hear yourself think again, to feel motivation return without force, to sense alignment between your actions and values that didn't exist before. The life that emerges after a reset isn't built on comfort or habit, but on intention, shaped deliberately from what remains after you've chosen not to carry everything forward. Number 6, becoming, not escaping. When life feels unbearable, the instinct is to flee. People chase new places, new relationships, new distractions, and even new versions of themselves, hoping that a change in environment will resolve the discomfort inside. But running is not transformation, it is avoidance. Escape offers temporary relief because it separates you from the immediate source of pain, but it rarely addresses the underlying misalignment. No matter how far you move, the unresolved patterns, fears, and compromises you carry will follow. True change doesn't begin by leaving. It begins by confronting the parts of yourself that created a life you no longer want to inhabit. Becoming requires staying present long enough to face the truth, not just to evade it. Becoming demands attention to your internal architecture. It asks you to examine what beliefs you've inherited, what compromises you've accepted, and which routines subtly enforce stagnation. Escape disguises itself as action, but it is passive at its core. It convinces you that progress is happening because something external is changing, when in reality, the internal conditions remain the same. In contrast, becoming requires deliberate choices, often uncomfortable, that align your behavior with your values. It's a process of dismantling old habits and constructing new ones consciously. Each decision about how you work, what you tolerate, and who you allow in your life becomes a brick in the architecture of a more authentic self. Becoming also confronts the illusion of instant transformation. Many try to outrun dissatisfaction quickly, hoping a single action, a sudden move, or a dramatic change will resolve the discomfort. But growth is cumulative. It requires showing up consistently, even when the world feels heavy, even when motivation fades, and even when the pain of the previous version of yourself lingers. You are reshaping patterns that were reinforced over years, sometimes decades, and that process cannot be rushed without collapse. This is why escape always feels more attractive, because it promises immediate relief, even if temporary. At the heart of becoming is responsibility. You must recognize that the life you want cannot be found outside yourself. It must emerge from within. This requires courage to inhabit your own discomfort fully, to confront fear without flinching, and to choose intentional action over instinctive avoidance. It is not glamorous. It is painstaking. Yet the more you practice becoming rather than escaping, the more clarity emerges, and the less enticing avoidance feels. Over time, the behaviors, values, and decisions you consciously cultivate replace the old patterns that once defined your existence. Becoming transforms your relationship with life itself. Escape teaches avoidance, reaction, and dependence on circumstances. Becoming teaches agency, alignment, and resilience. It shifts the focus from external validation to internal integrity, from fleeing discomfort to integrating it, from living a borrowed narrative to authoring your own. By committing to this process, you begin to experience life not as something to endure or evade, but as a canvas for deliberate creation. The life you resent isn't life itself. It's the version you've been living. The power to change it has always been within you. Step into responsibility, embrace growth, and choose becoming over escaping. Every small, honest action rebuilds the life you were meant to live.